Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Is It Fascist? This is one I've been wanting to do for a while, but I wanted to give a couple episodes to kind of get into the swing of things a bit before we attempted to cover it, because this one might be a little more complicated than some of the previous ones. I am talking, of course, about the Death Eaters or Lord Voldemort from the Harry Potter series. Now, anyone who knows anything about Harry Potter knows that the Death Eaters are the Nazi Party. Their ideology is explicitly National Socialism. Voldemort is like Hitler because he hates people like Hitler. He kills people like Hitler. He's completely insane like Hitler. You see, Hitler came to power on a policy of being a psychopathic mass murderer who was just going to indiscriminately kill and torture citizens of his own country who had no economic, cultural, identity policies whatsoever. And he was just a raving at the mouth lunatic for the entire duration of his rule. And every single strategic decision he made was also insane because he was a schizophrenic who was on drugs. Or at least that's what Rowling expects us to believe. Now, it's been a while since I've read the books. I've seen the movies a lot more recently. However, as I feel the movies fill in a lot of the blanks that Rowling left, and if I went mostly by the movies, that this score would be significantly different from what it probably will wind up being. I'll reference the movies, but if something happens in the movies but not the books, it's not going to be used as part of a scoring system. The problem with making this video is we know basically nothing about the Death Eater political program beyond the fact that they hate Muggleborns. Are they British nationalists? Are they like Grindelwald, where they're like wizard internationalists? What is their economic policy? What is their tax policy? Do they support or oppose immigration? What's their view on the voting franchise? What's their view on male-female relationships? Are they patriarchal? Are they homophobic? Are they transphobic, like the creator? Who even knows? J.K. Rowling said that Trump was more extreme than Voldemort, and MAGA didn't make the fascist line on this scale either. So we'll see how the Death Eaters go. But the point is that there's like absolutely no content to their political program. So what we're gonna do, and people sometimes get irritated at me because I do this for character profiles and reactionary reviews. If the original is just really lacking in detail or sucks, what I'll sometimes do is just fill in the blanks with what I think would be the rational, based on real world events or real world equivalencies or similarities, what that would be like. So for this list, we're going to be scoring the Death Eaters led by Lord Voldemort based off of how Rowling portrays them and how I would write this series if it was me, or how more realistically it would go. Number one, an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary, conservative, and revolutionary progressive ideas. Well, the Death Eaters have one ideological policy, as far as I can determine, and that's wizard supremacy, specifically pureblood wizard supremacy. There also seems to be some sort of human supremacy aspect to it, but, and this is probably the single most fascist thing about Voldemort, he overlooks that when it's inconvenient. So, like, if vampires or giants or werewolves can help him get into power, much like the Nazis with like the Japanese or the Finns, are like, oh, we're just gonna look the other way. This whole race thing isn't. We can't go overboard with it. But a lot of people, like in fan fiction, assume that they're like this conservative, patriarchal party of the nobility. Is there any actual evidence for that in universe? Did they complain about the erosion of wizarding tradition? I guess, in the sense that they let in Muggleborns. I think when they take over Hogwarts, they bring back corporal punishment or something. But generally speaking, I don't really recall there being much of a platform about preserving the power of the nobility. People make that assumption because Malfoy and a lot of the Death Eaters are blue bloods, and they seem to have a lot of support amongst the old families. But in terms of a political program that stresses adherence to wizarding tradition, it seems almost entirely racial. Now, is there progressive or revolutionary ideas? You could argue that maybe the degree to which they're blood purists is kind of revolutionary, but that seems to be like a fairly traditional, normal part of wizarding culture that kind of waxes and wanes. Um, I guess like they don't even really seem to have any sort of governmental reform policy. They don't seem to want to implement a one-party state, although they tried to make that implication a bit more in the movies. They are trying to implement a one-party state. They're not trying to create some like brand new governmental system to modernize Britain, to pull it out of the Victorian era, to restore a past that never actually existed. They just want to kill muggles. So I think we can give them a 0 in this category because I don't know if they really meet either criteria, but I guess they're more conservative than not. Now, if I was writing this, traditionally a lot of these, I guess you could say, right wing movements like this, and in particular with regards to fascism, grew out of a concern that the liberal, I don't know if you want to say upper middle class or middle class, was gaining power, that communism was going to come about, that the workers were going to take over the state, that there was going to be a redistribution of wealth, that the church was going to get smashed, that gender norms were going to get smashed, that you were going to have this radical regime that was going to completely destroy the social order. And so, in the case of Germany and a lot of countries that went fascist, you had this kind of alliance of, I guess you could say, socially conservative or religious, working class and middle class people with the old aristocracy, who theoretically their interests were against one another in a lot of aspects, but both of them viewed communism as the bigger enemy, and both of them were anti liberal. So I think a more realistic origin for the Death Eaters is they emerged within a wizarding Britain that was undergoing similar changes to the real world. That is, mass immigration was bringing in lots of wizards from Pakistan and China and Africa and stuff like that. And this was displacing jobs of the lower classes. That there was a wizard working class who was gradually getting displaced and being reduced to poverty. Meanwhile, you have Muggleborns from Europe or Britain itself come in, and they have much more dynamic economic ideas. They have connections to the Muggle world. Maybe they use some magical stuff to make money in the Muggle world and then become billionaires and then come back into the magical world. And the aristocracy, who I imagine mostly engages in like direct merchant adventures or fine crafts. I wouldn't be surprised if the Malfoys had a large agricultural estate. I'm not sure if that's specified in the books, but that they very much made money in the same way that the gentry in Britain did in the 18th and 19th century, and they were rapidly being displaced. And both sides hated the new rising liberal elite, so they formed kind of a coalition around the figure of Lord Voldemort, who is a populistic, charismatic figure who offered to deal with immigration, to create more kind of economic social justice, while at the same time protecting the traditions and privileges of the nobility, who threw their lot in with him because they really didn't see any alternative to it. So on my account, I'm going to give it a 1, and for Rowling, I'm going to give it a 0. Identification with a clearly defined in-group and an out-group. Now, this one's a little bit interesting because they are pureblood supremacists, but I'm not really sure how that applies to purebloods from other parts of the world. There's a bunch of foreigners in the Death Eaters. I can't really think if there's any non-white ones, though. Like, are they okay with purebloods from China or purebloods from Japan or Africa or Amerindian ones? I mean, I'm sure that there's similar traditions that exist in at least some other societies. In fan fiction, there's often this idea that Britain is unique and no other place in the world practices classism. Um, Even though classism is a really big thing in like South Korea or Japan. And I'm almost certain that the wizards there would have similar breeding policies. But is that like their sole concern? Because once again, it doesn't seem to have any cultural, nationalistic, or ethnic element. It seems to be, if we consider wizards to be a race, and specifically like a pureblood, the purebloods to be a sub race, I guess that is a clearly defined identity. But even then, it's very vague, and I'm going to give them half a point for this because I don't know if they're nationalist or internationalist or actually, you know what? I'll give them a full point because of how like radical they are about this, but that's being generous. Kind of a side note, it's interesting how fictional portrayals of Hitler and most modern National Socialists have this idea that the Nazi race laws were way more extreme than they were. Within the context of the Nuremberg laws, someone who was half Jewish was a Mischling. I don't think, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they sent Mischlings to concentration camps. Someone who was a quarter Jewish was a second tier Mischling, and the child of a second tier Mischling and a Aryan would produce a legal Aryan. So I think you had to have 6 or 7 grandparents had to be Aryan, whatever that meant, in order to be considered an Aryan. I think the technical definition of a pureblood is someone who has 4 wizarding grandparents. So by that logic, Ginny and Harry's kids would be purebloods because they would have 4 wizarding grandparents. The purebloods seem to have like this extremely like you have to be pure going back like 10,000 years or whatever. It sounds like some edge lords on pole who are pretending that they're like 6, 7, blonde hair, blue eyed. It's just it's not really a realistic what the race. It doesn't in any way reflect like what the racial policies would be. Now, with regards to me, I view the Death Eaters as more being kind of a nativist pop movement that combines kind of British nationalism, anti-immigration, the influx of modern culture being kind of grafted onto wizarding society. And so they kind of have a somewhat similar opinion to what a lot of kind of conservative populists or um, similar people would have, wherein there is a liberal elite that's attempting to replace them by bringing in. You could almost view like Muggle boards as being like wizards who are moving in from blue states, and like they're the locusts. They're moving into like Texas or Virginia or something, and they're changing the culture and political system there in a way that's anathema to the native to the current population. So I would say I think that would make more sense. So I'm going to give it a 1 for me. Number 3, a revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historical foe. Is there any aspect of the Death Eater movement that's even nationalist, yet alone revanchist? They try to cover this like in the show by introducing like the M, and they kind of try to make the M for Magic as Might like a swastika, and they try to make it like a lot more fashy in terms of how things look. And they even have a lot of like poor people, like poor white working class wizards as Death Eaters. But really, I guess they want to restore the purity of blood within the United Kingdom somehow. And I guess, like, I very reluctantly have to give them a point here, although I really don't want to. With regards to my version, I think I largely covered it previously. It's a British conservative populist group that's reacting to the dramatic social changes instituted by liberals and mass immigration. A belief in the supremacy of the party or state. I mean, the Death Eaters aren't a political party. They're just a bunch of psychopaths who go around and kill people. There's no political program. There's no infrastructure. There's no attempt to appeal to the public in general. You could argue they'll probably get a point when it comes to Vanguardism, but they don't seem to have any real plans for governing. They just seem to be a bunch of psychopaths. So they're going to get a 0 here. They'll also probably get a point for a charismatic leader, but no. I do think if you were going to have a realistic Death Eater movement, they would have been a lot more statist. They would have a political association similar to an actual fascist party, but they would also be statist and they'd want like protectionist policies, perhaps redistribution of wealth, maybe a specific tax being put on muggle borns, and other attempts to try to shift the tax burden and create more economic opportunity using stimulus programs for the white wizard working class. A conception of an idealized new man. I'm gonna say half a point because I don't think they're as status as some others. Are the Death Eaters? Do they have a conception of an idealized new man? Once again, by like the barest, most threadbare definition, maybe the new man is someone who's like is racially pure. But in terms of their like racial policies, they don't appeal to like genetics or progressivism or the desire for a revolution or anything like that. Their ideal wizard is basically just a wizard who doesn't have any muggle ancestors. So I'm going to have to give a 0 here because, like I said, you could argue, or maybe I'll give it a 0.5. They do have a definitive view of what a person can and should be, but it's defined solely in racial terms and there's no cultural content to it. If I was going to make my own version of it, I don't think there would really be much. I think it would just be more conservative and it would just be someone who's like a patriotic, hardworking Briton. Just as a side note, I like the idea that the Malfoys and a lot of the pureblood families are high church Anglicans. I just think that that would be funny. I don't know why. It's just, I can picture them as like posh Episcopalians. So I'm going to give myself 0 there. A nationalist foreign policy combined with an amoral, zero-sum, or realist conception of international affairs. I don't really think that there's much of a foreign policy that's discussed. Although, ironically, I would say the single most fascist thing about them is, like I said earlier, the willingness to make like all these exceptions to their racial policy and allow in like vampires and werewolves and giants and stuff like that. I think realistically, they would probably have relationships, maybe political alliances with wizards from other countries. If there's like a reactionary wizard regime in maybe Eastern Europe or Russia, or they might have international volunteers come in. I always think probably a better way to view the First Wizarding War is more like the Spanish Civil War than necessarily like World War One or World War Two. So foreign policy isn't really a big thing in the books, and I don't think it would be a big thing in terms of my conceptualization either, because I think the British tend to be pretty insular. An indifference to or marginalization of economics. This might be another one in which they succeed in getting a point by virtue of their lack of content. They don't really have an economics policy. They just seem to be entirely based off of racial concerns. So I guess I reluctantly have to give them a point here for that. For myself, I'm actually going to give this a 0. As I said, I think like an actual Death Eater movement would be more like MAGA or something, where protectionism, some form of redistribution of wealth or minimum income or stimulus programs that benefit the wizarding working class would probably be implemented. as well as tax breaks for the aristocracy. A masculine approach to problem solving, focusing on decisive action. I guess it kind of depends upon which reign we're talking about. In Voldemort's first reign, despite being overwhelmingly popular, for some reason he didn't opt to run for office or try to take political power in a coup. He just ran like gay ops behind the scenes and picked people off in this like indirect passive aggressive way. I guess eventually they took power in something resembling a military coup, although I don't really there's not really a lot of detail as to how that happened. But I don't know. I guess they're willing to use force, but at the same time, a lot of it up until like book 8 was just like gay ops and subterfuge behind the scenes, and I just feel like they vastly overcomplicated something that should be very straightforward and easy. And they only really won by virtue of their opponents being like completely ineffectual. So I guess I'll give them half a point here. Maybe that's too high, maybe that's too low. I don't know. I think in terms of what an actual Death Eater movement would look like, it would be very much about criticizing the liberal elite for not being able to fulfill the needs of the wizarding public. Um, I was going to do a Harry Potter fanfic at one point that took place like 15 years later, and it was going to be about a rising nationalist politician. It was going to start off with like the wizarding equivalent of Rotherham, where like a bunch of Pakistani wizards are like running a pedophile gang or something, and it was going to end with him being killed by Harry to ensure that immigration could continue immediately after he wins a legitimate election. So I do think that would be a big aspect of a real Death Eater movement. Encouragement of mass political action, often the form of a political party or other organization. That is 100% no for Death Eaters. They try to make it look that way in the movies, that they're more populist and the dregs of society join in. I don't really get that impression at all. If anything, they're a secret society, possibly Vanguardist, but despite having a lot of popular support theoretically, no one ever seems to have tried to win elections or implement their policies in any sort of legitimate way. So they're going to get a 0 there. I think a realistic Death Eater movement would be populist and would be based on trying to get a large coalition of working class wizards involved. So I'm going to say the Death Eaters, I guess, are Vanguardist in that they have an inner circle whose job is to propagate the rule of Lord Voldemort and I guess maintain pure blood supremacy. So I'm going to have to give them a point here. Um, and they're going to get a point there. As for what kind of a more realistic Death Eater political movement would look like, I'm not really sure, to be honest. It's kind of a tricky one. I'd say probably no. I think it would be more populist than Vanguardist. An often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. Obviously, that's Voldemort in this case. In terms of a real world equivalent, there's not really an obvious person to do that. I do think there would be a charismatic figure involved, but I'm not confident of it, so I'm going to give myself a 0.5. Sublimation of the individual and individual rights into the interests of the group, state, or party. This is going to be a tricky one. I'm not really sure how to go about this one, to be honest. I guess you could argue that based on their racial policies, Muggleborns don't get any rights. It doesn't really seem, though, that there's any real abrogation of pureblood rights. We don't know, like, I don't even know if due process would be maintained. I guess Voldemort's just a psychopath who kills people. So I guess we'll have to give them a point here. In my case, I think a lot of it would be about their traditional rights as native Britons. So I'm going to give it half a point there. And now it's time to tally this up. My interpretation of the Death Eaters got a score of 7 out of 12. I think that might be the same as what I gave Maga. But yeah, I think it would a more realistic portrayal would be more just kind of like economically populist, anti-immigration, supporting traditional values, some sort of kind of cross-class collaboration. But I don't think it would be anything like too insane like what we see in the books. Now, with regards to Rowling, this is where it gets interesting. We have 7.5. So it is literally zero point 0.5 away from being either para-fascist or not fascist at all. It's definitely not going to be in the fascist category. And like when you started this out and you think about it, this is something they always associate with Hitler, but it really doesn't have much to do with it. So let's go back. Let's see if there's something that I can put up or below. Okay. Masculine approach to problem solving. Maybe could I lower this one? Because is not having an economic policy the same as I guess it's a difference. A nationalist forum, I guess. A conception of a new idealized man. You know, I'll take away a point here because it's not really a new man. It's like this view of racial purity, but it doesn't seem to be like any kind of new conception like that came from evolutionary theory or scientific racism or pseudoscience or anything. So I am going to give the Death Eater movement, and I admit the rounding. If you want to say the rounding down to 7 was bias on my part, so it didn't get into the parafascist category, that's fair enough. But both my interpretation of the movement and Rowling's interpretation of the movement gets 7 out of 10. I think mine makes a lot more sense as I've attempted to describe it here, but are they a fascist movement? No, they just aren't. They're just a bunch of psychopaths who like to kill people who happen to be, if you want to